What's going on, everybody? Anthony Servino here, Face Off Sports Network, coming to you with my top starts and sits at the running back position for week one. Let's get into it. Javonte Williams, we're starting him. The Broncos versus Seahawks matchup is expected to be a moderately paced game with a 41.5-point total. This tells me that this is a game where both teams could rely on the running game to establish control. For Javonte Williams, this is an opportunity to showcase his ability as Denver's lead back, especially facing a Seattle's defense that is a favorable matchup. They allowed the third most fantasy points to enemy rushers last season, struggling at home. Javonte Williams is now fully recovered from his severe knee injury and looked really strong in preseason action as the clear-cut lead back after the departure of Samaje Perine, and with only Jaleel McLaughlin behind him to steal third down and passing game work. Williams is poised to take on a significant workload, especially on early downs. His ability to capitalize on Seattle's defensive vulnerabilities, particularly against the run, makes him a solid RB2/flex option for week one. Let's go to Zamir White, my next start. And when it comes to Zamir White, he is in a game with another low Vegas total of 40.5 points. This indicates a potential grinded out, run heavy contest with a lot of defense. This type of a game script is ideal for a player like Zamir White, who is expected to handle the bulk of the early down and goal line carries for the Raiders. Although White's role as a featured back remains in question, he is in a prime position to exploit a Chargers defense that struggled mightily against the run last season, allowing 24 fantasy points per game to running backs at SoFi Stadium. White could be a pivotal part of the Raiders' offense this week, especially if the game comes close, making him a viable RB2 flex option despite earlier concerns during draft season. Let's go to my last start we're going to talk about, and it's a guy I love. It is Aaron Jones. And this Giants versus Vikings game has a game total of 41.5 points. This suggests a competitive and balanced affair, likely involving significant rushing attempts from Minnesota. And with Sam Darnold making his first start, the Vikings may lean heavily on the ground game, giving Aaron Jones ample opportunities. Transitioning from Green Bay to Minnesota, Aaron Jones remains a key offensive weapon despite his age, and he is now in a system that favors the run. Despite facing a Giants defense that added stud edge rusher Brian Burns from Carolina this offseason, New York still projects as a vulnerable defense against the run, having allowed the third most rushing yards to enemy running backs last season. Jones's dual threat ability as a runner and as a receiver out of the backfield should be fully utilized in week one, making him a strong RB2 with legitimate RB1 upside. Now let's get to some of my sits. We're going to start with Chuba Hubbard, and this is another low game total. The Saints versus Panthers matchup carries a low total of 41.5 points. This is another indicator of a potentially low-scoring defensive battle that features heavy rushing attacks on both sides. When it comes to Chuba Hubbard, this means his fantasy value will largely hinge on volume, especially with Jonathan Brooks sidelined. Hubbard is expected to take the lead role in this backfield committee, making him a potential flex option in week one. But the Saints defense, which only allowed two running backs to score more than 13.9 fantasy points at home last season, presents a formidable challenge. While Hubbard's projected volume gives him some flex appeal, the tough matchup and low scoring potential of this football game suggests you should start him with tempered expectation or outright fade Chuba Hubbard. Let's go to Zack Moss, another sit of mine. And this Bengals versus Patriots game total is set at 40.5 points, the lowest of all the matchups we are talking about today. This is another indicator of a defensive struggle. Now, This is concerning for Zack Moss, who is projected to be Cincinnati's lead back, but that role does come with uncertainty. Now, Moss's role is very, very complicated by preseason hype around Chase Brown. This raises questions about the workload, not only in week one, but how the workload will be divided all season long. On top of that, the Patriots defense, as bad as it was last season, it was one of the toughest against the run. It allowed the third fewest fantasy points to running backs and the fourth fewest rushing yards in 2023. The combination of a bad matchup, a low game total, an uncertain workload makes Zack Moss one of my top sits for week one. Let's finish this out with Brian Robinson. Now, this Buccaneers versus Commanders game has a total of 43.5 points. It is expected to be a moderately paced game, providing a somewhat favorable environment for some fantasy production. However, Brian Robinson Jr. faces a number of challenges that could limit his overall effectiveness. Now, Brian Robinson Jr., he's likely to share some carries with Austin Eckler, making it difficult to predict his volume and overall impact in the game. This committee approach, combined with a tough matchup facing a Buccaneers defense that allowed the fifth fewest rushing yards and fantasy points to enemy running backs last season, makes Brian Robinson a risky flex play. The Buccaneers' strong run defense, particularly at home, where they allowed under 17 points per game to enemy backs last season, further complicates things for Brian Robinson, which is why he is one of my top sits for week one. That is going to do it for today. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the alert icon so you can be notified anytime we're live to drop content like this, or we are live to answer your fantasy football questions. That'll do it for today. I'm Anthony Servino. This is the Face Off Sports Network. We'll see you later.